Okay, we got Lawrence Wilkerson, retired. Here, wait, let me just get your bio up. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, retired U.S. Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Since his retirement, he's publicly criticized the planning and execution of the Iraq War and the global politics surrounding it. You're the former director of the U.S. Cuba Policy Initiative with the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, and you're quoted as saying, "Combined the detainee abuse issue with the ineptitude of post-invasion planning for Iraq, and wrap both of those in a blanket of secretive decision making, and you get the overall reason for my speaking out." And you said that January 19th of 2006. So thank you for being on Organic News on Awake Radio, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Thank you for having me.
So you've been speaking out a lot about things that you saw, that one in particular, the detainee abuse, and then the ineptitude of the planning for the Iraq war. And you have some other reservations that you had wished that you had gotten out even sooner. Can you talk about what those were?
Well, my principal reservations and concerns about speaking out finally in October 2005, I left the State Department in January that year, so it was almost 10 months before I decided to make a public statement. Had to do with the issue of torture.
Yeah.
And what I had seen as I was compiling a history of how we'd gotten to that point for Secretary Powell was that, unlike in the past, where America had engaged in similarly heinous activities in the Philippines, for example, at the turn of the century, in Vietnam under an operation called Phoenix, and probably elsewhere in our history too, this was a very different event for me because in none of those past occasions where the United States had engaged in rather heinous activities on the battlefield or elsewhere, none of those went to the highest levels of decision-making authority in the land, that is to the White House and ultimately to the president. This one did. And so it was some grievous concern to me that here I was, a military officer, having served 31 years in the Army, and I was looking at evidence, clear evidence, that torture and other abuse had been authorized not by some military commander in the field or not by some squad leader or platoon leader or company commander or whatever, been authorized by the President of the United States. And that's the greatest reservation I had, if you will, and that's the reason I began to speak out.
And you're quoted as calling Dick Cheney amoral, not immoral, but amoral. And because one of the things that he did was actually say that torture worked, despite the facts that even professional interrogators said that it didn't work, and that they could have gotten bin Laden a lot more efficiently in other ways besides using torture.
Yeah, it's even worse than that in my mind. Cheney said that he would do it again
Right.
if he were in a position of power to do so, which in my estimation is reprehensible. It's also a war criminal. It is the status of a war criminal.
Right.
There was a UN Convention against torture, which we, in very real ways, helped to bring about. We had to make our law when we became a treaty signatory to that convention. We had to make our domestic law conform with that treaty. And though we did express one or two reservations when we did that, they did not cover such things as this. And one of the great arguments. Hello?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay.
I have no idea what happened. It was fine, and then it just.
No, I don't know. I'm no expert at this stuff.
So okay, you were talking about what led up to, right, you were talking about torture and using torture and that it is a war crime and it is illegal. And the U.S. Also in history has prosecuted individuals for waterboarding participation.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
And so, like, why then did it become an exemption for the Bush administration?
Because the Bush administration, and in particular, 6 lawyers, starting with David Addington, who was the architect of the legal argument that was put out by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, and the president and his principal counselor, Alberto Gonzales, all said, and the vice president was the real bête noire here, if you will, he was the power behind the throne, that it was legal. And as you pointed out, Mr. Cheney has actually said that he would do it again. And he said that he doesn't regret a thing about having done it. It just goes to show you that I think basically what we have here is we have a group of cowards. We have a group of men who basically had never done anything in their life. Mr. Cheney, for example, got 5 deferments during the war that I fought in, the Vietnam conflict. And the president was a Texas National Guardsman, Air National Guardsman, who actually went AWOL in the last term of his service. So what you have here is a bunch of chicken hawks, what I call chicken hawks. You have a bunch of men who beat their chest and in public look like they're strong, brutal men even. And what they are is cowards.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think if you look through history, you'll find that cowards behave this way quite often. The psychological construct of a coward is such that he's more apt, she's more apt to break the law, more apt to do things like this than a person, say, of courage or a person of integrity, certainly. So what we had was a bunch of cowards in the White House, and the cowards performed as we might expect cowards to perform.
And why don't you think that anyone stands up to them? Congress, I mean, whoever doesn't just like call these people out for what they are.
Frankly, because it's become so profitable to do what they, in this instance, ordered to be done, and what other presidents have ordered to be done, and I dare say, sad to say, future presidents will order to be done. Look at what we're doing in the Syrian civil war right now. We're making companies like Raytheon and Lockheed and others that make armaments for war, we're making them salivate. We're giving their shareholders reason to have a Merry Christmas. This is what we have become. We've become a national security state whose purpose in life is to make war on other countries weaker than we are. And this is very profitable. It makes lots of money for these armaments makers, for these merchants of death. And what we have is a leadership structure that is captured by these merchants of death, captured by the politics of fear, indeed exploits that politics of fear to stay in office itself. And the American people let it go on. So ultimately, if you want to point the finger of blame at someone, you have to point it at the American people.
Yeah.
They've allowed this to happen.
That's right. I agree. I'm always saying it's not the 1%, it's the people that allow things to go on. I believe just recently I was looking at a post where, people were behind Trump. I mean, they're behind just blowing up these countries and people of these countries, just from what is basically said on like Fox News and the media that, works to promote the illegitimate, and I don't even like to call it war because it's not even. I mean, a war, you think of, two equally strong sides, and these aren't wars. I mean, I just call them genocide.
Well, I don't think, by the definition anyway, the UN definition, the agreed to definition of genocide, I don't think the majority of them are genocide, but I do think they're reprehensible.
Yeah.
And I do think you're right that it's the strong beating up on the poor, beating up on the weak, beating up on those without the capability to respond in a way that would make a bigger power think twice about doing it. And if you'll just put it into juxtaposition for a moment with the whole theory of terrorism and counterterrorism, what you're looking at is the only way many of these entities, whether they be state entities or non-state entities,
It's the only way they can respond. And they look at that JDAM coming off an F-16 or that Tomahawk cruise missile coming off a U.S. destroyer as an instrument of terrorism, just as much as we look at a plane flying into the World Trade Center as an instrument of terrorism. So, Reagan even said one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter and vice versa. I'm not trying to excuse the heinous and ruthless and brutal kinds of activity that particularly groups like ISIS, Daesh, ISIL, whatever we want to call it, or Al Qaeda, or Jamaat Islamiyah, or Lashkar-e-Taiba, or any of these terrorist groups that are killing civilians all the time. I'm not trying to excuse their actions, but I am pointing out the very real reason that many of them act the way they do, because they have no other recourse. It's similar with Hezbollah and Hamas with respect to Israel. They have no other recourse. There is no armed force of traditional nature on that side of the coin, if you will, that can stand up to the Israeli Defense Forces, and so they turn to terrorism. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it's understandable. And if you can't have empathy for the other side and crawl into their shoes and see it from their perspective, then you got no business being on the battlefield in the first place. In fact, you've got no business being a leader in a country with the power of this country if you don't have empathy and you aren't able to look at the situation, look at the issues from the other person's side, even if that other person's your enemy.
What about recently? I think it was a recent GOP. The question by Hugh Hewitt asking, the guy who's running, who's a doctor. You're right. Asking, like, it amazes me the questions that they get asked. I mean, like, he's not asking him, will he have a problem, being peaceful or trying to, come to some sort of, civil agreements or anything like that. He literally asked him on national TV if he wouldn't have a problem killing innocent people and calling it, necessary and part of war.
Well, that's the understanding of what I call these chicken hawks. They've never been to war. They've never been on the battlefield. They've never even been close. They don't understand what it's all about. Now, in the case of Dr. Carson, he's been a military physician, but I doubt very seriously if he's been up close and personal with swinging bayonets or firing rifles inside 30 yards at one another on a battlefield. So these are the kinds of statements, and most of the media are cut from the same cloth. First of all, the media does not know anything about what it's writing about these days. It bounces around from one issue to the other. Second, the media, for the most part, the mainstream media at least, as Ray McGovern is always saying, is the corporate media. It's the media that's wholly owned by General Electric or by some other corporation for whom it is either wittingly or unwittingly, and it matters not which, putting out the company view, the corporate view. You have to almost go onto the internet and find alternative media today, even to begin to get somewhere close to the truth. And what I do is I read the foreign newspapers. I read newspapers like Le Monde and El País, and I read the London Financial Times all the time. I look at other people's television as well, where I understand the language and can make out the programming. And I get a view of what they think of the United States, and that view is usually far more accurate, far more clear and precise than any view I get from U.S. media. If you watch and read foreign sources, you understand immediately what a very famous American said, I think it was in 1924, that Americans judge themselves by the way they feel about an issue. People overseas judge us by what we do. They don't care how we feel. They don't care that we've got the Declaration of Independence and busts of Thomas Jefferson in every public building and so forth. They judge us by what we do in the world. And when you look at it from that perspective, when you look through their eyes at what we do, we are the imperial power. We are Battlestar Galactica in Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica terms. We're the empire. We're the evil empire in many respects. When the Army polled in Pakistan a few years ago, some very exquisite polling to find out in the Fatah, in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan and in Pakistan at large, what the Pakistanis thought about the United States, they found out that the number one enemy by margins higher than 80% in really good polling, the number one enemy of Pakistan, as through the eyes of Pakistani people, was the United States of America, not India, not Al Qaeda, not the Taliban, not the guy next door, not the crook around the corner. In Pakistani eyes, the number one enemy of their country was the United States of America. And we polled all across the Arab countries, we polled all across the Middle East, Southwest Asia, Western Asia, Central Asia, and we found that in most cases, better than 50% of the populations thought that the United States was the number one enemy in the world. This is their image of us.
Yeah.
That ought to tell us something.
And what do you believe of the, the comments of Trump and not letting the refugees in until we know what's going on?
I think that's a reputation of everything we've stood for some 200 plus years, our national existence, if you will, since we broke away from Britain. We are a nation of refugees. There is no one here except perhaps the Cherokee and the Apache and the Sioux, who are genuine natives, or at least a millennium worth of natives of this land. We certainly aren't. We're Scotch, we're Irish, we're British, we're German, we're Spanish, we're French, we're Italian, and increasingly now we're Mexican, we're South American, Central American in general, we're Indian, and of course we're African because of the forced slavery that we had in this country for so many years. There's not a single, it always amazes me to watch this circus that's called the GOP primary campaign for president.
Yeah.
And listen to these people talk. They're all immigrants.
Right. Also, in November of 2005, right, the treatment of the detainees, Vice President Cheney decided the Third Geneva Convention would not apply to Al Qaeda detainees. What I always love is the way that they just decide to suspend, the laws of physics to suit them. Like the very guidelines and honorable behavior that a person in a leadership position is supposed to be uphold are the very criteria that they just toss right out the window.
Well, you're absolutely right. The unfortunate thing about man's behavior over the course of the last 3,000 years is that more often than not, we perform in the way that Dick Cheney and George Bush and that group of reprehensible characters performed during this time we're talking about. What happened after our Civil War, and particularly after World War II, World War I and World War II, was that the more civilized cultures in the world decided that this kind of behavior was really not acceptable anymore. And so we set about putting together conventions and treaties and rules and laws and standards that we hoped would prevent the worst abuses from happening again. Realizing full well that man being what man is, and now increasingly women, that we were going to have some abuse, but we were going to try to keep it at a manageable level and down at a level where indeed it could be managed. To elevate it to the highest levels in the leadership structure of a state like the United States, it's just a walk back along the brutal path into prehistory. It's a walk back to the times when we had no rules, we had no laws. And look at the hypocrisy of it, because we are supposed to be the leader. We're supposed to be the first power in this effort to escape this brutal culture that man had more or less built up over thousands of years. And here we are walking it right back into the caves again. And over something, this is what really makes it almost risible, almost laughable, if it weren't so serious and so pathetic. We did it over 3,000, roughly, casualties. We did it over fewer casualties than we take on the highways in this country in a single year. We did it over fewer casualties than we have from domestic gun violence in a single month. We did it over things that weren't existential. We did it over things that were not threatening to our statehood or our very being. We did it over some terrorists who happened to slip through our guard and kill some Americans. As tragic as that was, as reprehensible as that was, there was no reason to spend $4 to $6 trillion and set this country on an interminable course of war. And yet that's what we did. We are, by any stretch of the imagination or the reason, very stupid, very unwise.
And I mean, sometimes like I wonder, I mean, you're talking about the profit, the Lockheed Martin and all these corporations, Boeing, that are just making all of this money off of war. I mean, but where is it going to end? Where are they going to draw the line? Because I mean, they really are, attracting a possible attack on this country. I mean, like, you mentioned the people that join ISIS and turn to, terrorism. I mean, they're being pushed to that. So, right, like you keep pushing people and you're, asking for it eventually.
And yet, what you just said is a reason to continue it if you're one of these merchants of death.
Exactly.
It brings more profit and more profit and more profit. And the old fable about the golden goose, or the goose that laid the golden eggs,
Right.
It's perfectly applicable here. You've got corporate leaders, you've got businessmen and women who are making lots of money off this effort, and they don't have any compunction about killing the goose that laid the golden eggs, because this is not sustainable.
Right.
You cannot keep doing this. It's kind of like climate change in a way, although climate change is an existential threat, I think. And we do have some real challenges ahead of us if we're going to escape this threat to the whole human race. But it's like it in the sense that we just don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to treat it. We don't know how to escape the political chains that are on us. And so we just let it keep going when we know full well, or at least those amongst us who are smart enough and wise enough to understand this, that it's going to impact the entire human race. And we should know full well that this interminable war, this so-called war on terror, is going to impact the United States, and it's going to impact us in a very negative way. And yet we keep doing it.
Right.
We just keep doing it. It's not quite like Einstein said about beating your head against the wall and expecting a different solution or expecting the wall to fall. That's insanity. It's not quite like that. It's more like we're just ho-humming. We're saying, well, as long as it doesn't bother me right now, today, this minute, I'm not going to do anything about it. But it's going to come and get you. It may not get you tomorrow or the next day or next week, but it is going to come and get you.
Exactly. Why wait? I wanted to also mention that there is a call-in number, 917-947-9036. I posted it on social media, and I wanted to also, for anyone that has a question for Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, and I wanted to also mention something that I find really, really disturbing too, is the fact that the wars are not just out there. I mean, they are literally in this country with the militarization of the police, the for-profit prison system, the Correctional Corporation of America that, has, stock on the stock market. I mean, like how much more, I don't know, psychotic does it have to get? This lust for profit, and I just wanted to also mention the fact that I always like to mention, where does money come from? How is it made? What is it? Like, what are the ingredients of money? It's not even, I mean, it isn't real.
No, especially not since we came off the gold standard in 1971, 1972. and there's absolutely nothing behind the paper that we produce. What was behind it immediately after we came out with the gold standard, one might say, was the prestige, the shadow of power, as Dean Acheson called it, behind the paper. That is to say, the status of the United States, the economy, the GDP, the productivity of the American people, and so forth, was behind it. You're right. Today, it's very difficult to ascertain what's behind it. I'll give you a perfect example. I testified before the Senate Finance Committee some time ago, and the issue was Cuba, but we got widely ranging after a few minutes, and several of the senators were asking me questions about current accounts, about the deficit, about spending on war and spending on the military in general, and so forth. And I happened to mention that I was somewhat concerned that the imbalance between the United States and its principal competitor in the world, China, was becoming so bad that the Chinese had something like, at that point, 3.64 trillion US dollars in their current accounts. And one of the senators leaned across and looked at me and said, "Well, we're not worried about that, Colonel. There's plenty more where that came from." And I shrugged my shoulders and looked back, and I was like, "Okay, you've just identified what the problem is in this august body, and this is the Senate Finance Committee." What he meant, of course, was that he could turn to the Treasury and tell them to print more money.
Exactly.
Well, what is behind that money except the fact that we have, by the grace of God and our power post World War II, the reserve, actionable, if you will, currency in the world, the one most people flee to, the one most people want to hoard, and so forth and so on. And so that makes us capable of doing the kinds of things we do, like have a 19 trillion dollar debt, and have a GDP, a $17 trillion GDP that's composed of about 50% fluff, healthcare, cosmetics, drugs, and other things like that that don't really add a quintessentially scintilla-like object to the GDP or to the productivity of this country. It's a house of cards, and houses of cards tend to collapse eventually. And that's my concern. This whole thing is going to come breaking down on top of it, 330 million American heads.
Yeah.
And they're all going to look up and they're going to say, "Well, my God, nobody told me the sky was falling." Au contraire, Mr. American, Mrs. American. There are people who are telling you that this is unsustainable, that you need to get your act together, and you need to do something to change the course your state is on. But it's not happening. I don't see it happening. I've been in all 50 states. I've talked to people all over this country. Many of them understand my message, understand what's happening, understand that it's their fault, basically.
Yeah.
But far more don't understand, don't get it, don't want to get it, and don't want to do anything about it. And it's not going to happen. Nothing positive is going to happen to right the ship of state, as it were, if the American people don't take action to do it.
So I'm kind of wondering if that isn't, I kind of sometimes think that is the key, is to try, I don't know, try to get people to understand what money is, and the fact that, I mean, money is literally disconnected from reality, because the people that control it are disconnected from reality. And right, like you said, it's unsustainable. All this disconnection from reality can't possibly last. And I mean, why wait until the house of cards like falls on everybody's head? I mean, I mean, I mean, I don't understand why we can't, take these leaders, I mean, seriously. I mean, these people have serious uh, health issues, mental health issues, and need, I mean, people in power are not exempt from mental illness, and addiction problems like the rest of us.
No, they put their pants and skirts on the same way we do. I tell my students that all the time. I also tell them that basically to look around their seminar, my seminars are anywhere from 12 to 20 students. And I tell them, look around at your fellow mates in this seminar and realize that 90%, if not 100% of them are a lot smarter than any of the people in government.
Exactly.
Because I will tell you, we are not sending our top 10%, our creme de la creme, to the government. As a matter of fact, we're sending probably people from, on average, the bottom 50% of the United States. We're sending the best people, the top people, the Ivy League people, if you will, the elites. We're sending them to Wall Street, where they get busy very fast and fluff the rest of us of our hard-earned earnings. That's what America has become.
Yeah.
It's become a place where its talent goes to Wall Street. Its talent beats the heck out of the SEC, beats the heck out of the Congress, beats the heck out of everybody else because they're so much smarter than everybody else. And they accumulate money. They accumulate money at rates that are heretofore unseen in the world, rates that are obscene. I had a student not too long ago, one of the best students I've ever had, and he got hired by Goldman Sachs. And I told him, I said, you got to think about this. You don't want to go to Goldman Sachs. You are going to be depriving the government, your state, local, federal, whatever, or the Peace Corps, or some other aspect of public service, of some really extraordinary talent. And what are you going to be doing on Wall Street? You're going to be making money. And he looked at me and smiled and said, yeah, probably $250,000 in the first year. I knew I'd lost him.
And the thing that I can't understand is, I mean, clearly all of the power and money that they're making perpetuating all of these fake wars, I mean, it doesn't make them happy. I mean, it's not, what is it doing for them?
You know, you bring up a point that has always amazed me. I had to bring it up all the time when I was a kid with my father. My father was, by the standards of the time, a very wealthy man, and we used to have these arguments over what do you do with your money. You know, I have never seen a hearse with a cash register behind it, or a safety deposit box, or whatever. You know, what do you do with your money? And at that time, of course, we could have that conversation, and he couldn't come back and say, well, I'm going to leave it to you, or I'm going to leave it to your brother or your sisters or whatever, because we had such high inheritance taxes that inherited wealth was almost impossible to accumulate in the United States. Now we've destroyed those. Now we have generations passing on millions and millions to generations. Look at the Koch brothers, for example. As I understand it, neither one of them has ever done a lick of work in their life.
Exactly.
They inherited their fortune.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is the most poisonous, dangerous thing a democracy can do, is to allow generations to pass unearned wealth on, capital basically, to future generations. It contaminates them, it ruins them, it poisons them, it gives them power they shouldn't have. And it also has set up a situation, as Thomas Piketty points out in his marvelously well-documented book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, in French and English. It has also set the world awash in capital, not earned income, not income that was gained by producing something,
Right.
something of value to society. It's just capital that's been gained through no hard work or productivity at all, just an extension indirect of that hard work or activity. And it accumulates at a rate that is so fast now that you've got whole families who've never done a lick of work in their life, never turned anything out that was productive in any sense of the word with regard to value, and yet they got money that's obscene.
Right. And like what you're describing, you know, because like I really believe that it comes down to a severe disconnect from the natural world. Like we are so like obscenely, severely disconnected from the way that natural law works and where things really come from, you know, how things are really made, you know, how nature grows and things like that. And, you know, and man is creating, like, I'm just convinced that a completely Monsanto genetically modified world is being created in place of the beautiful earth and planet and animals that nature, God, the universe, whatever people want to call it, created.
And if you want to carry that analogy out another step or two and say that man is the only species on this planet that kills his fellow,
Yeah.
And does it in the brutal way that, for example, we did in World War I or World War II, or pick any war you want to pick. You carry that out further and you say we have built into ourselves our own extinction. And you get no argument from me, particularly today when I see us plowing ahead so ruthlessly towards that extinction.
It's the more things are about money and profit, that and fake genetically modified money that's completely disconnected from nature and reality, the more nature is going to rise up, and the people kind of behind it all are just looking completely more and more just mentally deranged, when just reality is just completely denied, like what happens in a lot of, like, even police cases, killings, and then they just let the cop off, or in the case of Dick Cheney and torture, and nobody is held accountable. It's just like blatant in your face, mental illness. I mean, I don't know what else to call it.
No, it's a good way to characterize it, I think. I'm sitting on a committee down in Washington right now that's interested in preserving the Constitution. And I have all kinds of characters on that committee with me, former FISA court judges, former directors of the FBI, Amnesty International, General Counsel. I mean, it's quite an eclectic group of people, but the thing that draws us together is the Constitution and our desire to protect it. And one of the issues we've been looking at over the past 3 weeks, and we'll look at in January in spades, is the militarization of law enforcement.
Yeah.
And what we haven't talked about, but it's been in the background of every conversation we've had, and on occasion I've had a conversation in the corner with this judge or that former FBI director or whatever about it. And that is how this is connected with what you and I have just talked about. This militarization of law enforcement across the country is connected to the effort to bring constant warfare as a state that will never end to this country. And when you do that, you've got to be prepared domestically, internally, to suppress the people and to control the people when they figure out finally what's going on and take some exception to it. So what do? You militarize the law enforcement agencies. And you do it under the rubric of anybody providing material support to terrorism must be countered. And so we need you law enforcement people, you county police, you state police, you city police, and so forth, to be equipped with the kind of equipment that we carry, we the military, in order to fight these terrorists when they finally come to our shores and so forth. This is all part of the same cloth.
There's a couple of more things I have in my arsenal of questions. I'm going to bring up, John Perkins, who wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and Miko Peled, who wrote The General's Son, because both of them write about. Miko Peled writes about martial arts. He compared his time in the IDF with his martial arts training, and how the IDF was all about just aggression, and that martial arts is balanced. I mean, it's balancing the hard and the soft. And I just bring this up because this is what I've pretty much like studied most of my life. And then John Perkins kind of is trying to do the same thing with his teaching people about like the indigenous cultures and just being closer to the earth. Because like I always felt like that was the answer. fitness and exercise basically for me was the answer, because I kind of grew up the same way. It was always like abuse is good for you. It builds character. and I was like, well, let me put that to the test and exercise and see where the line is drawn between building yourself, building muscle and the body up. And of course, there's a line of when it's going to be tearing it down. And clearly we're living in the life of tearing everything down and then calling it profit. But it's right. It's just it's a fake system that we've created.
We're doing what you're saying. We're doing that with the big pharmaceutical companies who are making a fortune out of milking as many Americans as they possibly can out of their hard-earned money for drugs that do nothing but hurt them, or at best are neutral. We're doing that through the system we've invented now for privatizing prisons. We actually have lobbyists here on K Street in Washington now who, if you can believe this now, go across to the Congress and lobby for more draconian laws so that we'll have more prisoners.
Yeah.
We already have more people in prison than any civilized state in human history.
Yeah.
And here we got these lobbyists on K Street going over and trying to get more because that's their incentive now.
Yeah.
We also have this business of 1/3, and this is something we're getting ready to study from the perspective of the military. We have 1/3 of the 18-year-olds in this country today who are so obese that they can't even be recruited into the all-volunteer military.
Oh, good. Maybe
well, yeah, but think about that for a moment. Think about that for a moment as a comment on what the healthcare costs are going to be when these young people develop diabetes and so forth and other diseases that are constant to being so obese. We have another third of the 18-year-olds who pass through, about 2.5 million of them who pass through the selective service system every year. Another third that is intellectually incapable of passing the Armed Forces vocational battery. That is the ASVAB, the test you have to pass in order to get in the Armed Forces. So we got 2/3 of the young people in this country who can't even do military service because they're too fat or too stupid.
Oh, well, maybe they'll just lower the standards to get into the military.
Oh, they already have.
Yeah.
And you're seeing what that's producing when you look at the number of suicides that are occurring, 22 a day now.
Yeah.
You look at the rate of post-traumatic stress and so forth. See, these people should never have been recruited into the armed forces in the first place.
What I've always tried to get people to look at is working and earning a living and to pay your bills should not cost you your health.
No, it shouldn't.
If you have to, tap into but the problem I feel like comes from the fact that people don't really know what health is. Most people just think of it as physical. Like nobody considers emotional or heaven forbid, spiritual health to be a part of health, and just actually being able to reach your optimum level of fitness. And I just always felt like most people's growth is fairly stunted. Just like your average kind of like working person, doesn't, lives this sort of like existence and doesn't really get to like reach their full potential.
What's your average sort of working person? I'll describe one to you who works with my wife. They have 3 jobs.
Yeah.
They come to work at 0600 in the morning. They work 8 hours straight. They take a break to wolf down a McDonald's hamburger, and then they run to their next job, which they work until midnight. And then they may drink a Coke or whatever, and then they go to their next job, which starts at 2 a.m. in the morning and ends at 5, and then they start their 6 a.m. job again.
Right.
And in all 3 of those jobs, they're making $24,000 a year.
And they don't see anything wrong with that.
Well, they do, but they don't know how to break out of it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is what I'm saying. We need we need like to just learn how to be healthier. And I always tried to get people to recognize, like just health wise, the signs and symptoms of just unhealthy relationships, and that goes with the people that are running your country too. I mean, most people just don't think about, uh, being in, like an abusive relationship with your job or your boss or your country or government. Codependency and terms like that are not, in most people's language.
I agree with you. I've got to run off and do something else. And when you figure out how to get the
Yeah.
masses in get them all generated in a way that they're willing to take all this on, let me know.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Take care.
Happy holiday.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.